Don't go upstairs, Mom. It's a mess, Mark said, the smile on his face stopping just short of his eyes. It struck me as odd. I'd raised 3 kids in a cramped farmhouse and seen every possible variety of mess: Legos like landmines under bare feet, half-eaten sandwiches petrifying in lunchboxes, socks balled up like tiny grenades under couches. Nothing about mess had ever scared me. But something about his tone, and the way his wife, Claire, flicked her gaze toward him and then quickly away, lodged in my mind like a burr in wool. I stood there in their entryway, my coat still buttoned, clutching the basket of cinnamon rolls I'd baked that morning. The smell was warm, a comforting intrusion into the house's otherwise sterile air. Mark stepped forward, his hand lightly taking my elbow, guiding me toward the kitchen. Really, it's not worth going up there, he added casually. The kids have turned it into a fort: blankets, chairs, the whole 9 yards. We'll just stay in the kitchen. I nodded, though his words did nothing to ease the itch in my mind. 2 years ago, when Mark and Claire had found this perfect house but needed just a little extra help for the down payment, I'd written a check large enough to cover nearly a third of it. I told myself it was for family gatherings, for the future of my grandkids, for the comfort of knowing my son had a safe home. But I'd been inside this perfect home fewer than 10 times since then. Claire always had a reason: the kids had homework, they were about to head out, the place was too chaotic. I told myself not to take it personally. Now, sitting at their immaculate kitchen table, I took a slow sip of coffee, my eyes following Mark's quick glance toward the stairs. That's when I knew, whatever was up there, it wasn't a fort. From somewhere above came a faint, deliberate thud, too heavy for a child, too purposeful to be play. The kids? I asked. Yeah, they're just moving their toys around, he said lightly, though his shoulders stiffened. When Claire reappeared, she was all smiles. Mark, can you help me move the boxes in the garage? Mom can just relax here. She placed a hand on my shoulder, the kind of gentle, distant touch you give strangers in hospital waiting rooms. They left through the back door, voices fading. The kitchen grew quiet. And in that quiet, the answer came: whatever was upstairs, they didn't want me to see it. And now, they were both outside. I rose slowly, knees aching, and began to climb. Each step felt like peeling back a layer of pretense they'd built between us over the years, this careful, smiling distance that I'd let myself believe was just life getting busy. At the top, the hallway smelled faintly of cedar. The kids' rooms were neat, beds made, toys stacked, no sign of chaos. At the far end, near Mark's office, I saw it, the safe. The one I'd bought years ago for my own home, passed on to Mark when they needed a place to keep important things. The door was open. Inside, nothing. Not a scrap of paper, not a coin, not the pearl brooch that had been my mother's only heirloom. The shelves were dust-shadowed where envelopes and boxes had once sat. My heart thudded slow and heavy. This wasn't a mess. This was stripped bare. I stepped closer to the safe, almost afraid to breathe. The faint smell of metal and old paper lingered, the ghost of a room long locked. Once, it had been full, not with gold bars or stacks of cash, but with milestones of my life: the deed to my little cottage, the updated will I'd written after Harold passed, the velvet box that held my mother's pearls. There'd been a thick envelope of savings, not everything I had, but enough to keep sleepless nights at bay. The last time I'd opened it was 6 months ago, to tuck away my grandchildren's birth certificates for safekeeping. Mark had been standing right beside me that day, chatting idly, his gaze drifting over the stack of envelopes more than once. I hadn't thought anything of it. You don't suspect your own child. Now, the shelves were bare. Not even the familiar weight of the brass key I used to keep tucked in the corner remained. My fingers brushed the cold metal inside, as if some memory might still be hiding in a seam I couldn't see. But it was as empty as the hallway behind me. Whoever opened this safe had done it cleanly. No damage to the lock, no sign of force. Which meant only one thing: they had a key, or they knew the combination. I turned, scanning Mark's office. The desk was its usual, unsettlingly tidy self, papers stacked neatly, pens in their holders. But the top drawer wasn't fully closed. Inside, I saw it, the folded scrap of paper with my combination, written in my own handwriting. I'd given it to him last winter, when I'd come down with the flu and he'd offered to fetch some documents for me. I'd thanked him then. Standing here now, I felt that gratitude turn to ash. Downstairs, I heard the back door slam. Their voices were closer now, footsteps crunching on gravel. I took one last look at the empty safe, then gently closed its door, the way you'd pull a blanket over someone who'd already left. By the time they stepped back into the kitchen, sleeves dusted from the garage, I was rinsing my coffee cup in the sink. "Find everything you needed?" I asked, as though nothing had shifted in the last 10 minutes. Mark nodded. "Thanks. Sorry to leave you alone." "It's fine," I said, smiling the kind of smile you give someone you've already started cutting out of your life. Claire moved past me toward the fridge, humming, but not before throwing Mark a glance, quick, sharp, and knowing. She knew. And she was waiting to see if I did too. The drive home felt longer than usual. Every passing mile seemed to stretch the silence inside my car, and that one word Mark had said, "careful," echoed in my ears, twisting in meaning the more I replayed it. When I finally pulled into the gravel drive of my small cottage, the air felt different. Calmer, perhaps, but maybe that was just me carrying this new, sharp awareness through the door. I set the untouched cinnamon rolls on the counter. My hands didn't go to the kettle, or to the mail. They went straight to my desk. The little fireproof box in the bottom drawer was still locked. My passport was there. My spare checkbook too. But the envelope with the past 2 years of bank statements, gone. It wasn't the sort of thing anyone would misplace. I kept my documents in perfect stacks, each paper aligned, and the gap left behind was as obvious as a missing tooth. If Mark had emptied the safe, he'd already been here, inside my home, without my knowing. And not just once. The phone sat in the corner of my desk. I scrolled to my bank manager's number and pressed call before I could talk myself out of it. "Mrs. Halloway," Susan answered, recognizing my voice instantly. "How can I help you today?" "I need to know if there's been any unusual activity on my accounts in the past month," I said, steadying my voice, one hand pressing against my knee to stop it from shaking. There was a pause. The sound of typing. "Well, I do see a few attempted transfers that were flagged by our security system. They were blocked for verification because the request came from a new device. One was for $8,000, the other for $15,000. When?" 3 days ago, and last Tuesday. 3 days ago, Mark had stopped by with soup because Claire thought I sounded tired on the phone. Last Tuesday, he'd borrowed my car to save me a trip. "Freeze everything," I said. "And I want to revoke the power of attorney my son holds. Effective immediately." "Of course. You'll need to come in to sign documents for a permanent change. I'll be there when you open tomorrow." When the call ended, I sat back, staring at my hands. They'd just made one of the hardest phone calls of my life, harder than telling people Harold had passed, harder than signing the papers to sell the family farm. Because this time, I'd chosen to close the door on my own child. The late afternoon sun slanted across the framed photo of Mark at 6 years old. My throat burned, but I refused to cry. That little boy was gone. The man who'd replaced him had looked me in the eye today and told me not to go upstairs. And I had gone. And found my safe as empty as the place where my trust should have been. I didn't sleep that night. Not from the usual ache in my hips or the old house creaking in the wind, but from the steady drum of my own thoughts. By morning, I decided on 2 things. I wasn't confronting Mark yet. I needed proof so solid even his silver tongue couldn't twist it. After the bank visit, I drove straight to the hardware store. I told the young clerk I needed a new smoke detector for my hallway and walked out with a small, motion-activated camera no bigger than a bar of soap. Back home, I installed it high on the wall, angled so it caught the front door, the living room, and the entry to my study. It looked like it had always been there, just another silent guardian of the house. The second camera went in my bedroom, hidden in the hollow of an old book spine I'd hollowed out years ago for emergencies. Then I staged my bait. In the top drawer of my desk, I placed a thick envelope stuffed with blank sheets of paper, weighted to feel like cash. On top, I left a sticky note in my own handwriting, mortgage payoff, do not deposit until December. It was the kind of note someone just passing through might see, and the kind of temptation that could tell me exactly what I needed to know. That afternoon, I called Mark. "I've been thinking," I said, keeping my voice warm. "It's been too long since I've had the kids over. How about Sunday dinner here? I'll make a roast." He hesitated only a moment before agreeing. Claire's voice was faint in the background, asking something I couldn't make out. When we hung up, I sat at the kitchen table, the camera's red standby lights winking at me like co-conspirators. If he came early, if he forgot something, if he so much as opened the wrong drawer, I'd have it all. It was strange, preparing for my own child as though he were a stranger I needed to catch. Stranger still was how natural it felt. Sunday came draped in the kind of cold gray that makes the world feel smaller. I lit the oven early, letting the scent of rosemary and garlic settle into the walls, a warmth that even I had to admit felt like home. They arrived exactly at 3. Claire carried a bottle of wine and the children barreled past me with quick hugs, already chattering about the pie they hoped I'd made. Mark followed, smiling that tight smile I'd come to recognize. "Smells amazing, Mom," he said, kissing my cheek. His eyes flicked, just for a second, toward the hallway that led to my study. I caught it. I filed it away. We ate in the dining room, the roast tender, the conversation light. Claire talked about a new yoga studio. Mark asked if I'd had any trouble with those telemarketers who keep calling older folks. "You should let me check your phone bill sometime," he offered, too casually. "I keep it under control," I replied, matching his tone. "Always have." At one point, Claire rose to refill the children's juice. Mark stood too, saying he'd grab the wine opener from the kitchen. I stayed seated, slicing a piece of bread. But in the corner of my vision, I saw him pass the kitchen doorway entirely, heading not to the drawers by the fridge, but toward the hallway. He was gone for maybe 90 seconds. When he returned, his smile was looser, almost relieved. "Found it," he said, holding up the corkscrew. But it wasn't the one from my kitchen. The corkscrew in his hand had a faint dent in the handle, the one I kept in the back of my desk drawer for opening letters and packages. I chewed my bread slowly, as if nothing had happened, but the air between us had shifted. He knew I'd seen the safe. I knew he'd been in my study again. And neither of us said a word. That night, after the dishes were washed and the house quiet again, I sat at my desk with a small black SD card between my fingers. The camera's footage loaded slowly. I fast-forwarded through the clatter of our arrival, the blur of coats, the bustle in the kitchen. Then I saw it, Mark slipping away toward the hallway, glancing over his shoulder once. In the study, he went straight to the top drawer. He opened it, flipped the envelope open, thumbed through the blank pages inside. His mouth tightened. He slid the envelope back, but not before pulling something small from his pocket and tucking it into the far corner of the drawer. I hit pause, leaning closer. It was a key. Not the old brass safe key, I still had that. This one was new, silver, with a green plastic cap. I'd never seen it before. I kept watching. Mark left the study and returned to the dining room. But a few minutes later, while I was in the kitchen plating dessert, Claire appeared in the hallway. She didn't hesitate. She went straight into the study, opened the same drawer, found the key, pocketed it, and left. She hadn't been looking for the envelope. She'd come for whatever Mark had planted. The sight of it chilled me more than the safe's emptiness had. Mark might have started this, but Claire was running her own game. I ejected the SD card, slid it into a small envelope, and wrote one word across it in my neatest handwriting: insurance. I didn't sleep again. The image of that silver key with the green plastic cap kept circling in my mind. It didn't belong to anything in my house, I was sure of that. And I'd never seen it on Mark's keyring before. In the morning, I dug out an old notepad and started listing every place it could possibly fit. Their garage? Their basement? A storage unit? By noon, I had an idea. Mark's house had a detached shed at the far end of the backyard, half hidden by an old maple tree. The few times I'd been there, the door had always been locked, and neither Mark nor Claire had offered to open it. Once, when I'd asked what was inside, Mark had said it was just tools and lawn stuff, in the same tone a child uses when saying don't look in that box. If the key fit that lock, it might explain why Claire had wanted it immediately. I didn't want to risk going there unannounced. Instead, I drove into town, parked 2 streets away from their place, and walked past casually, as though headed for the park. From the sidewalk, I could see the shed through the bare winter branches. The padlock glinted dull silver in the weak sun, almost the same color as the key in the video. My stomach tightened. On the way back to the car, I passed a small locksmith shop. The man behind the counter was older, with eyes that had seen too many kinds of trouble. I described the key as vaguely as I could, asking if he recognized the make. Green plastic cap, he asked, leaning back. That's storage facility stock. High security, rented units. Only a few places in this county use those. Which places? He named two. One of them was less than 3 miles from Mark's house. I thanked him and left, the cold air biting harder now. If Claire had taken that key, it wasn't for my desk or their shed. It was for something they'd kept far away, something they didn't want me, or maybe even each other, to see. And if that was true, my empty safe was just the start. The storage facility sat on the edge of town, a row of pale blue doors stretching away like sealed mouths. I'd timed my visit for late afternoon, when the shadows were long and the office lights were on, but the lot was nearly empty. The young clerk barely glanced up when I said I was meeting my son to drop something off. Once inside the fenced lot, I walked the rows slowly, reading the numbers painted on each door. And then I saw it, Unit 47. The lock was the same make the locksmith had described, and the metal around it was slightly scuffed, as if the door had been opened and closed a lot in recent weeks. I didn't have the key. But I did have something else, an old habit of watching carefully. A small white tag hung from the lock shackle, with handwriting in neat blue ink, paid through March, C. Claire's initial. I pretended to check my phone as I lingered in front of the unit, scanning for anything unusual. The lower edge of the door was dusty except for a small, clean arc on the right side, like something had been slid underneath and out again, more than once. Footsteps crunched on the gravel. I turned, heart tightening, but it wasn't Mark or Claire, it was the clerk, holding a clipboard. Everything okay, ma'am? Oh, yes. Just waiting, I said, smiling faintly. He nodded, but his eyes lingered on me for a beat longer than felt comfortable. Well, this row's off limits without the renter present. Insurance rules. Of course, I said, stepping away. As I walked back toward the gate, I glanced over my shoulder once. From this angle, I could see the narrow slot at the top of the unit's door, just enough to notice that the light inside was on. Someone had been here today. Maybe was still here. I didn't go back to my car right away. Instead, I crossed the street to a small cafe with a view of the facility. I ordered tea and sat by the window. 20 minutes later, a silver sedan pulled up. Claire stepped out alone, the green-capped key in her hand. She glanced around quickly, then unlocked Unit 47 and slipped inside, the door rolling down behind her. She stayed for almost exactly 11 minutes. When she came out, she was carrying nothing, but she locked the unit with the same care you'd give a jewelry box. I watched her drive away, my tea gone cold. Whatever was in there, it wasn't lawn equipment. And I was starting to think it might not be money either. 2 days later, I was back at the storage facility. This time, I didn't go inside the gates. I'd brought a small folding stool and a pair of binoculars, tucked in a tote bag beneath a scarf. From the public sidewalk just beyond the chain-link fence, I could see the row of units well enough. Unit 47 sat quiet. No car, no clerk in sight. I knew I wouldn't get in without the key. But I remembered the thin ventilation slot I'd seen above the door, wide enough for air, and maybe for a glimpse. I waited until the yard was empty, then slipped up to the fence. The slot was higher than I'd thought, but the stool gave me just enough height. I pressed my eye to the gap. The inside was lit by a single bare bulb. Stacks of plastic bins lined the back wall, each labeled in thick black marker, Tax 2005, Tax 2006, receipts, bills. But it wasn't the bins that stopped my breath. In the center of the unit sat a large cardboard wardrobe box, the kind movers use. Its flaps were folded but not sealed, and inside, I could just make out the shapes, photo albums, leather-bound and thick. One was open, and from my angle I could see the top page. It was a picture of me. Not recent, decades old. I was sitting in the backyard of my first house, holding Mark as a toddler. Behind me in the photo stood a man. Not Harold. Someone I hadn't seen in 40 years. The rest of the albums. I could only guess. But from the neat stacks, from the way the box was placed like a shrine, I knew one thing: Claire wasn't just storing things for convenience. She was curating something. A history. My history. And she'd done it without a word to me. I stepped back from the fence, my pulse quick. The wind felt colder now, sharper. I had thought the worst thing was that they'd taken from me. But what if the worst thing was that they knew more about me than I did? The bell above the cafe door jingled softly as I stepped inside. The air smelled of freshly ground coffee beans, warm milk, and faint cinnamon, a small comfort in a day that felt cold from the inside out. Claire was already there, sitting by the window. Her hands were wrapped around a mug, her eyes fixed on the street outside as if she could read the world's secrets in the footsteps of passers-by. I hesitated a moment before crossing the room. She looked up then, her smile polite but distant, the kind you offer to acquaintances, not to the woman who had given you life. "Thank you for meeting me," I said, settling into the chair across from her. She nodded. "Of course. It's important we talk." I took a deep breath. I saw the storage unit. Her eyes flickered for a heartbeat, just enough to let me know I'd caught her off guard. But then she composed herself with the grace of years spent hiding truths. "You went there alone?" she asked softly. "Yes." I didn't want to admit the binoculars and stool. Pride, or maybe shame, kept those details buried. She studied me. "You must understand. I didn't mean to keep things from you." "Things?" I repeated, voice low, almost trembling. "My albums, my papers. My life, Claire." "Why?" She swallowed, fingers tightening on her mug. "Because some memories are safer when kept hidden." "Safe from whom?" "From me?" I asked, the hurt sharp and sudden. "Or from yourself?" She looked away, staring at the rim of her cup. "I wanted to protect you. From pain, from disappointment." "But it wasn't protection," I said, voice growing stronger. "It was a prison. You locked away my past, and with it, a part of me." Her eyes met mine, wet and honest. "Sometimes, the truth is too heavy for one person to carry alone." I nodded slowly, the weight of decades pressing on my chest. "Maybe. But I need to carry it. Even if it's painful." The silence between us was thick, filled with everything unsaid, years of love and distance, of secrets and half-truths. Finally, Claire reached across the table, her hand hovering before settling gently on mine. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "For everything." I squeezed her hand, feeling the fragile thread between us. "Me too." Outside, the world moved on, indifferent and unaware. But here, in this small cafe, a fragile bridge was being rebuilt, one quiet moment at a time. The walk back from the cafe was slower than usual, each step heavier, weighed down by the conversation I had just had. The city felt both familiar and alien, as if the world I knew was subtly shifting beneath my feet. At home, I placed my keys on the worn wooden table, the same one that had seen decades of family dinners, laughter, and tears. I sank into my favorite chair, its cushions worn but comforting, and let my thoughts unravel. Claire's words echoed in my mind, "Some memories are safer when kept hidden." For years, I had accepted that silence, that absence, as a quiet fact of my life. But today, I saw the walls around me more clearly. Those hidden things were not just memories, they were pieces of myself, pieces I needed to reclaim. I reached for my old photo albums, the ones I had carefully stashed away. With trembling hands, I opened them, dust motes dancing in the sunlight that streamed through the window. Each page was a story, a fragment of the life I had lived and loved. And yet, so much was missing. Places where photos had once been, empty spaces that felt like wounds. I closed the album gently, realizing that healing wouldn't come from nostalgia alone. It would come from action, from facing the gaps, the silence, the betrayals, and rebuilding from there. That night, I wrote letters, not to send, but to say what had been locked inside for too long. Words poured out, raw and honest. I wrote about disappointment and hope, about pain and forgiveness. And in that act, I felt a small light flicker within me, a hope that maybe this was not the end, but the beginning of something new. Days passed in a haze of quiet suspicion and subtle observation. I found myself watching Eric and Julia more closely, noting their casual glances, the way their smiles didn't quite reach their eyes anymore. Their busy chatter about the garage, the kitchen, the kids playing upstairs, it all felt rehearsed, like a well-practiced performance designed to keep me occupied and distracted. One evening, while Julia was busy organizing the boxes in the garage and Eric was fixing a leaky faucet in the kitchen, I noticed a small detail, a receipt peeking out from under a stack of papers on their cluttered dining table. The date was recent, the store a high-end antique dealer not far from town. Curiosity gnawed at me. That night, I stayed up late, quietly rifling through some documents I had carefully hidden away in my own room, old bills, letters, bank statements. Then it hit me like a cold wave. The safe upstairs wasn't the only thing emptied. Several large sums had been withdrawn from my accounts, funds I had not authorized. It became clear, this was not mere forgetfulness or confusion on their part. They had concocted a plan to distract me, to keep me from noticing as they methodically stripped away everything I had worked so hard to preserve. The kitchen chaos, the children's fortress upstairs, the constant requests for help, it was all a smokescreen. I felt a mix of heartbreak and resolve. Betrayal stung sharp, but so did the knowledge that I was not powerless. They had underestimated the woman they were trying to deceive. The shock of betrayal slowly settled into a cold clarity. I knew I couldn't confront them head-on yet. I needed proof, a plan, and above all, control over the narrative. The next morning, I made a quiet visit to my bank. The young teller, polite but a bit impatient, printed out the statements for the past 6 months. As I scanned through them, every unauthorized withdrawal, every suspicious transfer stood out like dark marks on a white sheet. I asked for copies of all correspondence related to my accounts, emails, phone records, transaction approvals. Back at home, I quietly locked away the important documents in a new hidden spot, far from their reach. The old safe was useless now, empty, betrayed, a symbol of broken trust. I started keeping a detailed diary, noting every strange interaction, every hushed conversation that stopped when I entered the room. I even installed a small voice recorder in the kitchen, a decision born of both fear and necessity. Despite my age, I refused to be treated like a helpless old woman. The years had given me resilience, a quiet fire that no one could extinguish. I began researching my legal options, contacting a lawyer who specialized in elder abuse cases, preparing for the battle I never wanted but was ready to fight. Days passed with an eerie calm, but inside me, a storm was brewing. Every word, every smile from Eric and Julia felt like a carefully placed mask. I observed how they moved through the house, the way they glanced nervously when they thought I wasn't watching. One afternoon, while Julia was out shopping, Eric came to check on me. His tone was softer than usual, almost pleading. "Mom, please don't dig into things. It's better for everyone if we just move forward." But I wasn't the woman to turn away from truth. I showed him the bank statements and the notes I'd taken. His face paled. He didn't deny it. Instead, he tried to explain about debts, bad investments, a desperate need for money. I listened quietly. Betrayal cuts deep, but understanding the why is part of healing. I told him firmly, "You could have come to me. We are family." But trust is not so easily rebuilt once it's broken. He nodded, a trace of shame in his eyes. Yet, I knew this was only the beginning. The evening sun cast long shadows across the kitchen table where Eric and I sat, papers spread between us like battlefield maps. His voice was quieter now, weighed down by the reality he could no longer hide. "I didn't want you to worry, Mom," he said, eyes avoiding mine. "I thought I could fix it all before you found out. But I was wrong." I leaned forward, my hands resting firmly on the table. "Eric, hiding things only deepens the wounds. We should have faced this together." He nodded slowly, exhaustion etched in every line of his face. "Julia and we came up with that mess upstairs just to keep you distracted. We thought if you focused on the kids' chaos, you wouldn't notice what was really going on." My heart clenched, not from anger, but from the heavy weight of their deception. The fortress of blankets and toys was never about fun, it was a smokescreen for their secrets. "But why?" I whispered, barely recognizing the tremble in my voice. "Debts, bad deals. I thought if I could keep everything under control, you wouldn't lose the home you worked so hard for." I was wrong. "I'm sorry," Eric said, voice cracking. For a long moment, silence filled the room, thick with regret and unspoken apologies. Days passed slowly after that conversation. I found myself walking through the house more often, touching things, trying to anchor myself in the reality of what had happened. The silence was heavier now, a quiet that pressed against my chest. Eric and Julia kept their distance, offering hesitant apologies and promises to make amends. But trust, once broken, is like shattered glass. No matter how carefully you try to piece it back together, the cracks remain. I began calling banks, lawyers, and even friends who could help me untangle the mess. Each call brought fresh worries but also a strange sense of relief. Action was better than waiting. One afternoon, as I sat by the window with a cup of tea, I realized something. This house, this home, was more than bricks and mortar. It was memories, laughter, tears, everything I had built with my hands and heart. No betrayal could take that away. I decided to fight, not with anger, but with resolve. For myself. For the future I still wanted to claim. Weeks turned into months. Slowly, the house began to feel like mine again. I cleared out the remnants of the past, the empty safe, the missing papers, the broken trust, and filled the space with new routines and quiet strength. Eric and Julia reached out occasionally, their voices softer now, tinged with guilt and regret. I didn't know if we could ever fully heal, but I learned that forgiveness is not about forgetting, it's about finding peace. I started gardening again, my hands digging into the soil just as they had for decades. The earth was patient. It didn't judge, didn't rush, just waited for me to grow alongside it. One evening, as the sun dipped low, my grandson's laughter echoed through the yard. He ran up to me, his face bright and trusting. "Don't go upstairs, Grandma. It's messy there," he said with a grin, echoing words that now felt like a bittersweet reminder. I smiled back, wrapping him in a warm hug. "Maybe not, sweetheart. But sometimes, we have to face the mess to find what really matters." And in that moment, I realized that life, messy, painful, and beautiful, goes on. And so will I. In the quiet moments, I often found myself reflecting on everything, the years of hard work, the betrayals, the love, and the losses. The pain of Eric's betrayal still stung, but it no longer defined me. I began writing letters to myself, words I didn't say aloud, hopes I held secretly. I wrote about the strength it took to rebuild, the courage to face disappointment without letting it break me. Neighbors noticed the change too. The old woman who once seemed fragile was now seen tending her garden with purpose, greeting passers-by with a gentle smile. I wasn't just surviving anymore, I was living. Julia called one day, her voice trembling. "Mom, I'm sorry. We made a terrible mistake. Please forgive us." I took a deep breath. Forgiveness wouldn't erase the past, but it could open a door. "I forgive you," I said softly. "But trust will have to be earned." And with that, a new chapter began, one where love was cautious but not closed, and hope was fragile but persistent. Months passed. The cold ache of betrayal slowly thawed into a quiet resolve. I spent my days organizing my affairs, reclaiming control of my life piece by piece. The empty safe became a symbol, not of loss, but of resilience. Eric and Julia's apologies were sincere, yet the wounds they caused needed time to heal. We started with small steps, phone calls, brief visits, conversations about mundane things. Trust was fragile, but with patience, it began to grow. One spring afternoon, I invited them over. We sat in the garden beneath the blooming cherry tree, sunlight filtering through the branches. For the first time in a long while, laughter came easily. We spoke honestly about mistakes, regrets, and hopes for the future. That day, I realized forgiveness was not about forgetting or excusing, but about freeing myself from the bitterness that had weighed me down. I was ready to let go of the past and embrace whatever came next. As the sun set, I stood quietly by the porch, feeling the warmth on my face. The house was still old and creaky, the world outside uncertain, but inside, there was peace. "Don't go upstairs, Mom. It's a mess," Eric had once said, with that strange, haunted smile. But now, I knew better. Sometimes the mess is only a mask for pain, but behind it, love can still grow. And I was ready to climb those stairs again, not to find what was lost, but to build something new. As I close this chapter of my story, I want to thank you for listening, for sharing in my pain, my doubts, and ultimately, my hope. Life is fragile, and trust even more so, but every ending holds the seed of a new beginning. If my story resonated with you, if you've ever felt the weight of family struggles or the sting of betrayal, please consider subscribing to my YouTube channel. There, I share more real-life stories, reflections, and moments of healing, a space where no one walks alone. Your support means the world to me. Together, we can turn pain into strength and loneliness into community. Thank you, and I hope to see you there.